Hey, I'm Denny Tedesco, and I'm a CGO.
Always saying guitars are playing a part of who we are. Got a cool job, but there's so much more to the chairmen and women of the pedal board. You're a CGO, Chief Guitar Officer.
The show where success meets guitar.
Welcome to Chief Guitar Officer. I'm Scott Haidt.
And I'm Judd Silver. Scott, more music is being recorded and released now than ever before. And so much of it is still influenced and inspired by music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s.
I couldn't agree more. It's really easy for us now. You crack open the laptop, open a session, start recording. But back in the day, it was all about the studio musicians. Detroit had Motown. Down in Memphis, they had Stax. These were essentially the bands that were on these big hit records.
That's right. In LA, there was a group of musicians that became known as the Wrecking Crew. And they played on countless hits by countless artists.
Yeah, I mean, here's the list. Look at this. They played on records for the Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds, the Monkees, even the Batman theme song. When I was a kid, that Batman theme song probably influenced me to play guitar just as much as the 70s records I got into after.
Oh yeah, this music influenced pop culture more than, still to this day it's influencing pop culture. In the 70s, another group of musicians came around who also played on many, many hit records and still tour and play together as a band today, known as the Immediate Family.
Yeah, it's just as impressive, this list. They played on records and acted as the band, essentially, for James Taylor, Carole King, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, the list goes on and on.
In the Wrecking Crew, there was a guitar player by the name of Tommy Tedesco. At that time, Tommy Tedesco was arguably the most recorded guitar player ever. His son is a very talented and successful filmmaker who has created 2 documentaries to go back and tell the very, very interesting and amazing stories of all of the musicians and the people behind all of this great music.
Yeah, those 2 documentaries are The Wrecking Crew and The Immediate Family. And I'm telling you, these are must-see docs for anybody that's interested in music, whether you're a musician or not.
Yeah, we wanted to find out what makes him tick and get his story. So Scott, tell us who our guest is today.
We're really excited to welcome Denny Tedesco. And guess what? He's a CGO.
Award-winning filmmaker, true documentarian of the power of guitar, a real immediate family member of the Wrecking Crew. CGO Denny Tedesco, welcome to Chief Guitar Officer.
Wow, it's impressive. Thank you.
It's great to see you. It's great to see you. What is a day in the life of Denny Tedesco these days?
It's like everybody else. We're just all trying to figure out what the next thing is, trying to get projects going. I have another project on Wolfman Jack that I'm trying to get off the ground, so I'm looking for financing for that. You just keep going.
What are some other things you're working on?
Well, as a freelance producer, I work for other people. So I do content for other directors and produce and direct some other things as well. But as a documentary maker, I'm just working on whatever I can get going. So there's always things in the pipeline. And there's another project about a Manhattan Transfer we're trying to get together. And there's another one about Leslie Gore that's already finished. So I'm just trying to find those finishing funds to pay off the licensing and stuff like that. So it's just like a musician. You always have every gig is your last gig.
Right.
So
right. The work that we know, the Wrecking Crew, the Immediate Family.
Well, it's interesting because for those who don't know anything about the Wrecking Crew, let me just give them a brief background. They were a group of musicians in the 60s in LA that did all the rock and roll stuff. They were doing the recordings. They were, Jan and Dean, Mamas, Papas with Dimension, Sinatra, Elvis, anything that came through LA, this group of musicians had a hold on it. And it wasn't because most of the time bands in the groups themselves could not play. They weren't that great to be in the studio when you had to knock out 3 songs in 3 hours. And so when you got Phil Spector and Brian Wilson, you get the best of the best at that point. My dad, Tommy Tedesco, was one of those guys. So growing up, I never saw my dad play guitar. It's so weird. People think it was always like like a jam at my house. I never saw my dad play guitar until the 70s, and I'm born in 61. And it was only when he started doing his own music that I saw him play at home, because he always went to work every day, 12, 14 hours a day. He's not coming home to practice. He need to do that. And so watching Dad's career in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, well, 80s, and then it's slowing down. And then 1992, Dad has a stroke. And it stopped his career. And at that point, I'm a filmmaker. I was a technician. And I wanted to tell that story of those musicians of the 60s, what these guys really did. And I started doing that. And then Dad got cancer. And then I really started doing that. I had no choice but to jump into telling the story. And watching, it took a long time. We'll go over that later, but 19 years to get it finally out. But I saw that film hundreds of times with audiences. And I saw the impact that this story made with audiences. And it wasn't because it was my film.
You were able to tell that story in a way that I find as a film viewer and as a musician, that you were obviously so close to it.
Yeah.
But you weren't so inside of it that you let that get lost in the story.
I appreciate that. But I watched people, every song, it was not just about the music, but every song was a bookmark in someone's life. For you, Be My Baby might mean something totally different than me. It depends on age and whatever we were doing.
You've really been able to capture and document and memorialize an extremely valuable and important component of American culture.
I appreciate that.
What is your feeling about them, the importance of these films and what they mean to the American pop culture landscape?
Yeah. Watching people respond to the personal stories. They all had dreams. We all have dreams. We all have hopes. We all have heartache, failures. And I think that's the most important thing, is to get something out of that when people, they're not all supermen. They're not, they all have their kryptonite, and everybody has that.
The work is so pervasive. It's so welcome and part of everybody's hearts at this point, so influential, and is carried on into now. I mean, it still connects with people.
Yeah, and the music connects, which is really interesting. Well, you wonder, is the music of today going to connect 30, 40 years from now? I say it will. Not so much because it's better or it's not better or worse, or whatever. I think everybody connects at that moment. The hard thing is if you're growing up today, which I didn't have the problem, is the amount of music or the amount of things coming at us. So you might not feel as, but it's not true, because I see my kids talking about, God, do you remember that song in 2010? What?
Right. So it's really the generation, because if you grew up in the late 50s and 60s when your dad was making this music with this group of musicians, or the later film, The Immediate Family, Carole King and James Taylor and Jackson Browne in the early 70s, Linda Ronstadt, then you connected with that group of musicians.
Absolutely.
And that film tells that story. So it's really just generational.
It totally is generational. But it's interesting. The only thing I disagree with sometimes with my audiences, and I say it with love, my audiences, they don't make music like they used to. I said, no, they do. It might be a different technique, but there is great music out there. There's some fabulous and amazing tracks out there. It's a matter of finding it. When I'm in 1970, I'm, what am I, in 1970, I'm 9 years old. You go back 50 years, it's 1920. There's nothing there for me to listen to. 30, there's it. Now, big bands, I'm maybe hearing from my parents. But now the kids have, the amount of possibilities. You just got to, get through the crap.
Well, I guess it's just a testament to your skill and talent as a storyteller to be able to take that raw material and deliver it to the audience and convey that message and have people respond to it.
Yeah, but it's also, you got to hit on the personal thing. Why do I relate to Tommy Tedesco? Why do I relate to Leland Sklar?
Is there a story that can pick up where Immediate Family leaves off?
With Immediate Family, the story about these guys, Leland Sklar, Danny Kortchmar, Russ Kunkel, Waddy Wachtel, and Steve Postell, this group of guys who are in their 70s, who basically are playing together in a band that they put together, but they're still working on the side. You still got Russ and Leland on the road with Lyle Lovett. You still got Waddy with Stevie Nicks. and they're doing it because they love what they do. And like they're in the late 70s. They're all 77 and 76 right now. And I think that's really what is inspiring, is to do what you love and never stop.
So it's their personal story that you're portraying and getting out, not necessarily just relying on what they created as the music.
Yeah, no, it's both. I mean, listen, you have to have what they create. It's, it's like when you see, them Waddy Wachtel telling Steve Perry, you ain't gonna put a fucking sax solo there. He starts playing a guitar solo on the Steve Perry song.
Nico called me to come out and play on this song called Oh Sherry by Steve Perry. I said, sure, yeah. So I went out to record one and laid down the eighth notes for the basic rhythm track. So I did that, and they said, okay, that's great, man. Thanks a lot. I went, what do you mean, thanks? Wait a minute, what? What do you mean? What are you talking about? What about that section? What about the solo section? And Nico goes, no, he's going to put a saxophone there. I went, no, he's not. He goes, what? I said, he's not putting a saxophone there. I said, play the tape. I know what should go there. And Steve came in and just went out of his mind and went, what? What's that? I said, that's your solo. He goes, oh, man, that's great.
You want a solo that you'll never forget? The solo in Oh Sherry, the solo in Only the Lonely. All these solos that he plays are memorable.
These guys, all of you guys, all musicians, you try to create something that's going to stick,
That's right.
And I remember my father, in his seminars, and he would tell the guys at MI, Musicians Institute at the time, he said, listen, guys, he goes, I'm working with John Williams. There's maybe one or two chairs with John Williams, with guitar chair. When you get to this level, it's hard to break in. So you have to figure out how to break in. You have to, and a C chord is only going to do so much. You got to figure out how that C chord is going to change for that other guy to go, oh, that was good. What was that?
Yeah.
You change it up.
So the personality has to come through.
Oh my God, yeah. And it's like there's nothing worse than when I hear people say, oh, reading music stifles your creativity. Bullshit. All it gave you is another tool to work with. My father never read everything that was on the page, note for note. What he did is took the music and looked at it and figured, it goes, okay. And that was it. And he'd take a run with it. He made music out of what was on that paper.
You witnessed some of just experiencing the essence of your dad.
Oh, God, yeah.
And then obviously this footage and all these things you've poured through. So in a lot of ways, you've met so many interesting people, witnessed history. So with that, did you get an opportunity to take these opportunities to maybe give back?
Well, it's interesting because my father gave back more than anybody of his era. They'll all tell you that. Carlton will tell you that. All the young guitar players are all in their 70s now. But that next era behind him, he was always there. Joe Osborne, who's the great bass player, said if it wasn't for your dad, he goes, I never would have read music. Now, Joe Osborne was the greatest bass players in the world, but my dad said to him, Joe, what are you doing? Learn how to read a little stuff so you could get the shit jobs, the stupid jobs that, just going to bring you money. But he was always there. And I learned a lot about him giving back after. I mean, I always knew he was giving, with, musicians, because he was like their guru, their godfather in these phone calls I would overhear. And it wasn't about guitar. It was about life. And that was really interesting to hear people, how he figured out how to deal with, with his own life and other people's lives in the business, how you kind of get through it. But when he passed away, the stories that came out, one of the greatest stories was Chuck Rainey, the bass player, who was, one of the greats of all time. He told me, he goes, I was doing a MASH session, And I'm on MASH doing the score with Benny Golson was the leader. And he goes, I don't know your dad. I never met him. And I sit down in the bass chair and I'm, I'm a record guy. And all of a sudden, orchestra's there and I'm playing this bass part and it goes into an odd time in the middle of it. So the orchestra starts and it gets to this odd time signature and I mess up. It changes and I mess up. And out of nowhere, your father makes a huge mistake on his side. And he goes, boom, hits a bad chord. And everybody looks at Tommy. Tommy, okay? Yeah. Sorry, guys. Let's do it again. Roll the film back. And now this is, huge orchestra. And Chuck goes, oh, thank God. And then they get to the same part and Chuck's struggling through it. And Dad hits it again. Boom. And they look at my father and said, what's up? Sorry, guys. I dropped the pick. It'll be fine. Okay, roll back. Let's go back to one. And he turns to Chuck. He goes, now you're on your own. So he was covering for him. He knew he was struggling through it. And
That's
he knew
great.
Wow.
he knew Chuck, the new guy, even though Chuck's a new guy, basically covering him. And he knew he couldn't take that hit. That guy can't take the hit maybe as much as my father could take a hit. My father's going to come back the next day,
Right.
so he knows how far he can take it with someone.
And now you're able to really put those stories forth and continue telling that story and letting people know like how generous of a man and a musician he was.
And I think that's the most important thing about life is being generous with each other. And musicians have that opportunity because they're working with each other. You're not a solo painter. You know what I mean? So you can actually show and give. You're recommending someone that might take your job sometimes. But you just got to, you want to recommend. You don't want to recommend someone bad. But at the same time, it's going to come back to you.
Through these films, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but obviously the subject matter relates to guitar, your father being possibly the most recorded guitar player in history, correct?
Well, yeah, kind of, maybe. At this point, I think maybe not, but that's okay.
When did you first notice the impact in your life on you when the guitar just came into focus? Like, wow, this is really important.
In the 70s when he was doing it for himself. Like I said, I didn't see 1977 Dad starting to do these jazz albums. He'd done albums in the 60s, but I was too young. And like I said, I didn't grow up with him in the house sometimes because Dad's going to work, 9 o'clock call. He's not coming back till maybe midnight. And maybe even then he's doing a midnight session or midnight recording with maybe someone else. So I didn't really see Dad. He never practiced. I just saw him take these guitars. This is the worst. You guys will love this. We live in Los Angeles. He packed his car with the guitars. It was like every other father had their tools in the trunk. He had a Telecaster, a mandolin, maybe an acoustic, the amp, 12 string, whatever he had to put in there. They were always in there and they were packed perfectly. Remember this?
Right.
He never took those things in and out of the car, a house. So in LA, and it's in the summer, it's like 109 today. They were still in there. But you realize he's going gig to gig to gig to gig to gig to gig. He didn't have cartage in the early days. I'm sure there were times when I'm sure there were a lot of pop strings and he'd just go to he'd play it somewhere else on the fretboard. He was amazing with that stuff. So seeing him play wasn't until the late 70s. And then I saw the love he had for playing. Not realizing how much Dad had worked on, or sometimes thinking Dad worked on everything.
Right, of course.
We didn't know until like the 70s, like he's doing his own stuff. I see that, and I'm hearing him on the radio on the jazz station. And then in the 80s, he's really killing it in films. And I think then because as a kid, now I'm in my 20s, I'm starting to relate to him.
Right.
Oh, what are you working on? Oh, man, that's cool. Or I just saw that film in film class at school.
Right.
And I saw your name on the end of it. That's when I started relating to it. I didn't relate to the rock and roll that he was doing. I was too young.
At that same time, you're born early 60s. You were interested in some other music yourself. What other types of things were you listening to?
My older brother's 10 years older than me. So I'm hearing the stuff he's bringing home. And it's stuff that my dad worked on. But again, my dad's not listening to that music. So it's weird. So I remember growing up listening to the Beach Boys. And stuff like that, and then some of the Phil Spector stuff. There was a 45s, But then in the 70s, when I'm starting to, now I'm a teenager, my brother's working working in publishing at Warner Brothers. So now he's bringing all those Van Morrison albums back, James Taylor albums and things like that. I'm starting to hear all that stuff. Then you start understanding what your father did. And it wasn't until this film in my 30s when I started to delve into what he was really doing. A lot of that stuff we didn't know because it was, even though it was on contracts, that was the only way he knew what he did. Sometimes he didn't know what he did,
Right.
Which is weird. But how do you not know you worked on a session? Well, you're going in there, you're doing those are the days where you had 3 hours to knock out 3 songs. You're doing 3 hours of this session, getting in the car, driving to Warner Brothers. 3 hours there, getting in the car, driving to Gold Star. And you do this all day long.
Right. And it ends up being like the Bonanza theme song or Green Acres or Batman or some amazing TV show.
Yeah, I mean, TV shows you kind of knew because they were repetitive. On a Monday at 11 o'clock a.m., it's in his books, I'm being honest with that, is Green Acres. So he knows that's Green Acres. There's a title, Green Acres. It's Vic Mizzy. He knows exactly what he's doing on TV shows and stuff like that because it says it. But sometimes, when he did Up, Up and Away with the Fifth Dimension, Jimmy Webb gave him a nice little charm. It was a Grammy charm for winning for the Song of the Year or Record of the Year. And he says, "What's this for?" He goes, "This for the recording we did with the Fifth Dimension on Up, Up and Away last year." He goes, "Oh, okay." Now, Dad didn't even know he's on it. When you listen to it, you go, incredible. How do you not know that you're on it? Because he's, he does his run with his gut string. Well, he's not listening to, don't forget it, he's going into a session, he's doing 3 hours, maybe they're knocking off one song, but it's just the rhythm tracks or whatever he's doing, or there might be, he's just tracking. Sometimes there were never singers in the room. With Phil Spector stuff, the singers were never there. You never had the Ronettes or the Crystals singing with the guys. Same thing with the Fifth Dimension with Dad or the Beach Boys. Beach Boys were never there. Browne was the other one. So you're just listening to rhythm tracks and leaving in 3 hours. Oh, guess what? Now you got a film call. Your mind goes, you just, it goes away. You're dumping it.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine if you would never get anything done? You kept remembering what you just did 3 hours ago. I can't remember what I did yesterday. Do you know what I mean? Think about it. And these guys are going boom, 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 boom. So the only way we knew what he did was because of contracts that came up later.
All right, Denny, all this guitar talk, maybe you could share a guitar with us.
So there's the Telecaster that he had. That became a very famous guitar. Well, he was doing all those rock and roll dates with it. Whatever he was doing. He did the Marquettes with it, Out of Limits. He did the Batman theme. He did the Green Acres theme with it. Anything he was doing electrical Telecaster, that genre in the 60s. He had this thing, the Telecaster. And he was doing a Mike Nesmith date for the Monkees. It was a solo album that Mike did. And Mike basically put all the money, he just threw money away that weekend because he had too much, I think, so he spent it on doing a recording. And he had all the guys there. He had Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer, the drummers, and he had James Burton, and he had all the guitar, it was like probably about 30 people. And all of a sudden, Shorty Rogers comes over, and Shorty Rogers is a real jazz guy. He goes, "Hey, man," he goes, "Mike wants you guys to, go crazy at the end." Okay. Well, that's giving my father an opening that you're just, it's horrible. So at the end of the song, my father takes his Telecaster, throws it up in the air, it comes crashing down. And everybody goes, "Holy shit." They see this guitar go up in the air and crash, and it's on the album. You hear it. So that became a legendary guitar that retired at that point, and everybody signed it. So it's pretty cool because you got all the guys sign it,
That's like a museum piece. That's incredible.
It is actually in a museum. It was at the MIM Museum for a while. Now it's at the Fender Museum. So it's bouncing around.
You have a guitar there you want to show us. Let's see what.
Yeah, but I hate to say it's not my dad's guitar. It's an Ovation signed by Glen Campbell.
Oh, wow.
So he gave me that when we were when we were doing our thing. Glen made Ovation. If it wasn't for Glen, there'd probably be no Ovation.
And of course, they played together in the studio.
Yeah, and Glen was, like that. Dad said he was, in the time, Dad worked with him. He said he was the best rock and roll player I played with. People don't think, he's just this country picker. Glen could play the shit out of that guitar. And Glen couldn't read a note. Now, there's a guy that can't read a note. But he would, if there was the paper in front of him, he was like, and he turned to the other guys. In those days, by the way, you always had 3 or 4 guitar players on a session, which is so unusual now. I mean, can you imagine 3, 4 guitar players all the time? So we turned to my father, "Hey, Tommy, what's this?" Asking him something, and Dad tell him, and then they just let him fly. Glenn had the ears.
Yeah, so not all of them were sight reading and just trained that way.
No. In the studios, you had to have somewhat. But like Glenn, for example, no, Glenn's a specialist. Glenn's coming in there. Glenn is going to play his guitar for what you want. I asked that to my father. I said, what is the difference between a session player and a specialist? He goes, there's a door that's closed. You get to the door, you open it up, you walk in, you don't know what you're doing. You sit down, there's a piece of paper there, and it's calling for mandolin, it's calling for acoustic, it's calling for gut string, it's calling for electric. He goes, maybe it's the blues. He goes, I'm not the greatest blues player at all. But if you want the greatest blues player, you bring in a Robin Ford or you bring in a B.B. King. But you can't ask B.B. King to play a gut string or read what's there. You bring in B.B. King to play B.B. King. You bring me in to pretend to play the blues for those few bars to make it sound right, or be a classical player for those few times, or the mandolin. And Dad would do this with all the guitars. And now what some of you probably do know or don't know, he played all these instruments, bouzouki, mandolin, tipo, from Brazil, anything that had strings on it other than a sitar. It was electric sitar he would play. He would play it. But what he did was he tuned it like a guitar. So he never played traditional tuning. And the reason was, he goes, I can't make mistakes. If I'm John Williams says, hey, Tommy, what happened? It's not right. And you can't just say, well, it's the right tuning, but I just don't know where I am. He needed to know where he was, and he could do that. And he wherever it was in the fretboard, he can make it work. Did you ever see the Leland Sklar story about my father? He's working with Leland doing a TV show in the 70s. And Leland goes, they had those booths, or the, what do you call it, baffles. It was like Kilroy. You only could see this part of a player. You didn't know what was going on below him. And Leland's there. He sees everything. And he goes, and then he goes from the booth, Tommy, can you play it on a 12 string? Yeah, sure. And then Leland goes, he bends down, brings up the same guitar, and starts playing. And he plays it in a different way. No, let's hear it on a da-da-da. Bends down, brings up the same guitar. And he keeps doing this for 3 or 4 guitars until they get right, which is the same guitar that he started with. Right. Yeah, that's great. Perfect. And Leland went, oh my God. He goes, all the education I would have ever had, I got the best one just now.
Well, I've heard Leland update that to having a switch installed on his bass.
Yes.
So that when a producer asked him to make a change, he could just hit that switch and it wasn't connected to anything.
Exactly. And that switch is called the fuck you switch.
Exactly.
It literally lights up on his bass. It's hilarious.
Awesome.
Fantastic. So the films, The Wrecking Crew,
yep.
Immediate Family, still available. People can.
It's traveling around the country. We're trying to find foreign sales now, but it's on Hulu now. Or if you can't find a Hulu, it's on all the pay-per-views. You can rent it anywhere. But it's really important these stories get told and shared. I tell people because they'll never get seen, and these stories need to be told before people leave. I'm very fortunate to be one to be able to pull off something, Wrecking Crew, if I wasn't there at the right time, it would never have been told. Not because I had the opportunity, but no one wanted to know it at the time. That's why it took 19 years to get it out.
Well, you also had the tenacity to go and really make it happen. I mean, I know the whole background with the publishing and, getting all the rights to the music and everything. So thank you for doing that, because you've been able to preserve this. And like you said, continue to tell these stories, and they are very important stories.
I appreciate that. And I tell people, if you like it, tell people. If you don't like it, don't tell anybody. That's my motto.
And if people want to keep up to date on what you're working on, like future projects?
Yeah, it's DennyTedesco.com. So I'm just traveling the country. I'm trying to do, I do not benefit concerts, but screenings, where I'll go do a screening somewhere for maybe a charity, or we just do a screening and we just, make some money for all of us. So we're bouncing around the country doing that. And if Leland's available, I take Leland with me, who's the greatest travel buddy ever.
And used to being on the road.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh, it's embarrassing. I'm barely awake, and he's pulling me in the car. He's 70 something years old, It's so embarrassing.
Denny, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you for doing the work, because it's been an effect on my life. It's been an effect on Scott's life. Such an important part of our culture.
I appreciate it. And thank you to all the musicians out there and all the guitar players. I actually took a lesson yesterday, first time in years. So I'm going to get that third chord down. Maybe we could do a follow-up.
That's our show. Thanks for watching. And remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Check us out on all the socials at Chief Guitar Officer.
And we want you on the show. Go to chiefguitarofficer.com, look for the section called You're a CGO, send us your video, and be featured on a future episode. Just like this.
Hey, I'm Dave Weintraub, the CEO of Pinnacle Promotions in Atlanta, Georgia. This is my Collings I-35, and I am a Chief Guitar Officer.